So there's Marcus Rodriguez, standing in the shuttle bay of the most notorious military academy in three-star systems, wondering if his life insurance policy covers death by alien instructor. The Galactic Military Training Academy on Korthak looked exactly like what you'd expect from a place with a 90% dropout rate and a reputation for turning soft recruits into military-grade nightmares. Think boot camp, but designed by sadists who breathe methane and consider pain a food group. Marcus was the only human in a program that had killed tougher species than his for breakfast. Literally. The Korthakian mess hall served something called Essence of Fallen Warrior on Tuesdays, and nobody asked too many questions about the ingredients. Welcome, meat sacks, to your extended vacation in creative suffering, announced Instructor Vexter as he materialized in the training bay. And when I say materialized, I mean this 12-foot-tall crystalline nightmare just walked through solid steel like it was tissue paper. Vexter looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a chandelier, then given the whole thing anger management issues and a gym membership. The other recruits, a colorful assortment of aliens who could bench press small vehicles, took one look at Vexter and started updating their wills. Marcus, being human and therefore spectacularly bad at recognizing when he was outclassed, just stood there with that expression humans get when they're about to do something monumentally stupid. You. Vexter's voice sounded like gravel being processed through a wood chipper, are the human I've heard so much about. He leaned down until his crystalline face was inches from Marcus's considerably smaller human one. Tell me, tiny meat thing, what makes you think you belong here? Marcus, demonstrating the kind of situational awareness that had gotten humanity into trouble since the dawn of time, looked up at this living embodiment of violence and said, well, I figured if I was going to die horribly, I might as well get a good story out of it. The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before natural disasters. Vexter's crystalline features shifted into what might have been amusement, or possibly indigestion. Orientation begins now, Vexter announced, and promptly punched Marcus in the face. The sound of breaking cartilage echoed through the training bay as Marcus hit the deck, blood streaming from his thoroughly rearranged nose. The other recruits winced in sympathy, except for the rock creature in the back who was already calculating funeral expenses. Marcus sat up, wiped the blood from his face, and looked up at Vexter with the kind of calm that should have been a warning sign to anyone who'd spent time around humans. Day 1, he said conversationally, and I'm already having fun. Vexter's crystalline eyes gleamed with something that might have been respect, or possibly the reflection of overhead lighting. Either way, Marcus had just signed up for 90 days of the kind of education that came with a mortality rate and its own medical wing. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be the universe's punching bag, Marcus could have written a detailed manual by day 3. The Galactic Military Training Academy didn't believe in easing recruits into the program. They believed in throwing them into a meat grinder and seeing what came out the other side. Preferably still breathing but definitely no longer optimistic about life choices. Marcus's fellow recruits were an interesting bunch, assuming your definition of interesting included beings who could accidentally kill you while trying to be helpful. There was Pip, an insectoid creature who looked like a praying mantis had mated with a cheerleader, complete with way too much enthusiasm for activities that involved potential dismemberment. Gornath was a walking boulder with the personality of someone who'd already attended his own funeral and found it disappointing. And then there was Zara, a telepathic humanoid, who could read minds but chose to use this gift primarily for sarcasm. Your thoughts are very loud. Zara mentioned to Marcus during their first meal together, which consisted of something that might have been food if you squinted and had a very flexible definition of edible. Also very stupid. You're actually looking forward to tomorrow's training. Marcus, whose nose was now an interesting collection of colors that didn't occur in nature, shrugged. Pain is temporary. Stories are forever. Gornath made a sound like an avalanche having an anxiety attack. Stories are for survivors. We are not survivors. We are future cautionary tales. But Marcus had that peculiar human trait of getting more stubborn when things got worse, which was unfortunate because Vextar had apparently decided to take Marcus's continued existence as a personal insult. The training regimens designed for species who could bench press small planets were already challenging enough without the instructor adding creative modifications specifically for the squishy human. Day 5 brought the gravity chamber, where Marcus was supposed to demonstrate his ability to function under forces that should have turned him into human pancake batter. While his classmates handled the increased gravity with various degrees of success, Marcus just kept going, his face turning interesting shades of purple but his legs still moving. How is the meat sack still conscious? Vextar muttered to his assistant, a smaller crystalline being who spent most of his time updating casualty reports. Unknown, sir. By all calculations his cardiovascular system should have collapsed 14 minutes ago. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering that getting angry made everything hurt less, which was convenient because Vexstar was providing plenty of motivation in that department. When the instructor cranked the gravity up to levels that made Gornath's rock composition start to crack, Marcus just gritted his teeth and kept walking. The real problem started when Marcus began accidentally breaking things. Not breaking down, which everyone expected, but breaking records that had stood for decades. The obstacle course that was supposed to take 40 minutes. Marcus finished it in 32, mostly because he was too stubborn to admit when something was impossible. The endurance test that was designed to find each species' breaking point. Marcus just kept going until they ran out of test. This is not normal, Vexstar observed as Marcus completed his 50th consecutive pull-up, his form getting better instead of worse as his classmates collapsed around him. Define normal, Marcus gasped, still climbing. Week 2 was when things got properly weird. And by weird I mean the kind of weird that makes alien instructors start questioning their life choices and updating their insurance policies. Marcus had developed what the medical staff were calling adaptive resilience syndrome, which was their fancy way of saying we have no idea why this human isn't dead yet, but here we are. The problem, from everyone else's perspective, was that humans apparently didn't follow the standard biological rules that governed the rest of the galaxy. When Gornath needed recovery time after heavy training, he literally shut down for 6 hours like a computer rebooting. When Pip's exoskeleton got damaged, she needed 3 days in a regeneration pod. When Zara pushed her telepathic abilities too hard, she got migraines that could be detected from orbit. When Marcus got tired, he just got grumpier and kept going. This doesn't make sense, Dr. Kellix, the Academy's chief medical officer, explained to Vexadar while reviewing Marcus's latest test results. Kellix looked like a cross between an octopus and a filing cabinet, with tentacles that could perform surgery and a personality that suggested he'd rather be doing anything else. His lactic acid levels should have killed him yesterday. His stress hormones are off the charts, but instead of breaking down, his performance is improving. Vexadar studied the readouts with the expression of someone watching his carefully constructed worldview crumble. Perhaps we are not pushing hard enough. This was, in retrospect, exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. The acid pit exercise was designed to test a recruit's ability to navigate hazardous terrain while maintaining tactical awareness. Most species approached it with careful planning and protective gear. Marcus looked at the bubbling pool of corrosive death, shrugged, and asked if there was a time limit. 60 minutes is the standard, Vexadar replied. Curious to see how the human would handle this particular challenge. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then proceeded to parkour his way across the obstacle course like gravity was a polite suggestion and chemical burns were just another Tuesday. He finished in 18 minutes, singed but grinning, while his classmates were still calculating approach vectors. How? Pip buzzed in amazement, her compound eyes tracking Marcus as he casually brushed acid residue off his uniform. I figured if I moved fast enough, the acid wouldn't have time to eat through anything important. Marcus explained with the kind of logic that made perfect sense to humans and gave everyone else headaches. The gravity chamber incident was next. Standard protocol called for gradual increases in gravitational force, allowing each species to adapt at their own pace. Marcus, however, had apparently decided that gradual was for quitters. When Vexadar cranked the gravity to 3 times galactic standard, expecting to finally see the human struggle, Marcus adapted by changing his gait and just kept jogging. At 5 times standard, where even Gornath was showing stress fractures, Marcus was doing jumping jacks. This is impossible, Vexadar muttered, watching his carefully calibrated torture device fail to produce the desired results. His bone density should not support this. Maybe human bones are made of something different, suggested his assistant, who was frantically taking notes for what was becoming a very unusual training report. The combat drone exercise was supposed to be the final nail in Marcus's coffin. The drones were programmed with combat algorithms from 12 different warrior species and armed with weapons set to painful but not lethal. They were designed to overwhelm recruits through superior numbers and tactical coordination. Marcus approached the exercise like he was solving a puzzle rather than fighting for his life. Instead of trying to outfight the drones, he started using them against each other, turning their superior coordination into a liability by positioning himself so their attacks interfered with each other. When that stopped being challenging, he started catching their projectiles and throwing them back. By the end of the session, he'd reprogrammed 3 drones using percussive maintenance, built a small fort out of destroyed robot parts, and was using the remaining functional drone as an impromptu training partner. I think they like me, Marcus announced cheerfully as the last drone sparked and fell over. Vexadar stared at the wreckage of what had been his most challenging training exercise, then at the human who was now patting the disabled drone like a pet. Somewhere in the back of his crystalline mind, a small voice was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, he had bitten off more than he could chew, but Vexidar was a professional, and professionals don't admit defeat. They just escalate until something breaks. Unfortunately for everyone involved, humans were apparently really hard to break. Day 37 was when Instructor Vextar made the kind of mistake that separates professionals from legends, and legends from cautionary tales told in hushed whispers across the galaxy. It started during morning formation, when Marcus showed up looking like he'd been hit by a freight train carrying smaller freight trains, but still standing and ready for whatever fresh hell the Academy had prepared. Vextar had spent the previous evening reviewing Marcus's files, looking for some weakness he could exploit, some psychological pressure point that would finally crack the insufferably resilient human. What he found instead was a service record that read like a comedy of errors, a medical history that should have disqualified Marcus from military service, and psychological evaluations that used phrases like dangerously optimistic and pathologically persistent. "Attention recruits," Vextar announced, his crystalline voice carrying across the training yard with the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything and wasn't planning to start now. Today we discuss the realities of galactic warfare and why some species are naturally suited for command while others are better suited for target practice. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably. Gornath made his worried avalanche noise. Pip's antenna twitched nervously. Zara's telepathic abilities didn't require actual mind reading to sense where this was heading. The human military record, Vextar continued, pulling up holographic displays that showed various human conflicts, demonstrates a species with admirable tenacity but limited tactical sophistication. Humans excel at dying bravely, which is certainly useful, but leadership requires more than enthusiasm and the ability to ignore obvious danger. Marcus listened to this assessment with the kind of calm that should have been a red flag to anyone who'd spent more than 5 minutes around humans. His classmates knew that look. It was the same expression he got right before he did something that defied physics and common sense. "Your species," Vextar continued, warming to his theme, "lacks the natural armor of the Carthakians, the regenerative abilities of the Zephyrians, the tactical intelligence of the cerebral collective. You are by any objective measure, inferior in every category that matters for advanced military operations." The training yard had gone dead silent. Even the automated systems seemed to be holding their breath. "You survive through luck and the charity of your betters," Vextar concluded, his crystalline features arranged in what might have been satisfaction. "Which is why you will never graduate from this academy." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this assessment with the serious attention it deserved. Then he smiled, and anyone who'd spent time around humans would have recognized that particular expression as the moment when diplomacy died and spite was born. "You know what, sir?" Marcus said conversationally. "You're probably right. Humans are pretty terrible at a lot of things. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we don't have natural weapons or armor or any of those other advantages." Vextar's crystalline features shifted into what might have been triumph. But Marcus continued, his voice still perfectly calm. "We are really good at being too stupid to quit. And right now, I'm feeling exceptionally stupid." That was the moment when Marcus Rodriguez stopped trying to survive the Galactic Military Training Academy and started trying to prove a point. It was also the moment when the Academy's casualty insurance rates went through the roof. The change was immediate and terrifying. Where before Marcus had approached each challenge with determined optimism, now he attacked them with the focused intensity of someone who had something to prove and absolutely no interest in hearing why it couldn't be done. The endurance run that had been giving him trouble, Marcus ran it until the monitoring equipment broke from trying to track his vital signs. The strength assessment that measured lifting capacity in progressive increments. Marcus kept adding weight until they ran out of weights, then started using the testing equipment itself. "This is not normal behavior," Dr. Kellix reported to Vextar, his tentacles waving in agitation. "His stress responses have completely inverted. Instead of breaking down under pressure, he's entering what can only be described as a berserker state, but with tactical awareness intact." Vextar watched through the observation windows as Marcus worked his way through an obstacle course designed to test the limits of Carthakian reflexes. He wasn't just completing it, he was redesigning it as he went, turning obstacles into shortcuts and hazards into advantages. "Perhaps," Vextar's assistant suggested carefully, "we should consider reducing the difficulty of his training regimen." Vextar's response was a sound like crystal breaking in slow motion. "Absolutely not. If the human wants to prove himself, then he can prove himself against the absolute limits of what this academy can provide." This was in hindsight, exactly the kind of decision that gets made right before everything goes horribly magnificently wrong. The other instructors started taking bets, not on whether Marcus would graduate, but on whether he would die in a spectacular fashion or simply transcend physical reality through sheer bloody-minded determination. The betting pool reached record levels when someone suggested a third option, that Marcus might actually succeed, which would require them to completely recalibrate their understanding of what was possible. By day 50, Marcus had stopped sleeping, not because he couldn't, but because he'd apparently decided that sleep was for people who weren't busy proving points to crystalline instructors with superiority complexes. By day 60, he'd started improvising his own training exercises using academy equipment in ways that voided several manufacturer warranties. By day 70, the other recruits had started following him around like he was some kind of deranged motivational speaker who expressed his philosophy through creative applications of physics and violence. "I think we may have made an error in judgment," Vexstar admitted to his assistant as they watched Marcus bench press what appeared to be a small spacecraft while explaining advanced tactical theory to his mesmerized classmates. "You think?" his assistant replied, frantically updating incident reports that were beginning to read like fantasy novels. Day 90 arrived with a kind of ominous atmosphere usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. The final examination at the Galactic Military Training Academy was legendary throughout the known systems, not because it was particularly challenging, but because it had a 100% mortality rate for anyone who failed. And failure was defined as losing single combat against your instructor. Marcus stood in the center of the Academy's main combat arena, a circular pit surrounded by energy barriers and medical equipment that had seen more use than anyone was comfortable discussing. The arena had been designed to contain conflicts between beings who could level city blocks when they got creative, which should have been reassuring except for the fact that the walls showed recent repair work. Vexstar entered the arena with the confidence of someone who had never lost a final examination and had no intention of starting now. His crystalline form seemed to absorb the arena's lighting, creating prismatic effects that were probably beautiful right up until they started cutting through solid matter. "Well, human," Vexstar announced, his voice echoing through the arena with crystalline clarity. "You have survived longer than anyone expected. I admit, I am impressed by your persistence." Marcus rolled his shoulders, working out kinks that had accumulated over 90 days of creative torture. "Thanks. I'm impressed by your ability to make everything sound like a funeral eulogy." The audience of Academy staff, fellow instructors, and surviving recruits watched from the observation deck with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents and political debates. Gornath had calculated the odds of Marcus's survival at approximately 0, which he'd rounded up from the actual number to be optimistic. Pip was vibrating with nervous energy, while Zara was projecting a telepathic field that basically amounted to "this is going to be messy" in 7 different languages. "Combat parameters are simple," Vexstar continued, extending razor-sharp crystalline appendages that looked like they'd been designed by someone with strong opinions about efficient dismemberment. "No weapons, no assistance, no mercy. Victory is achieved through your opponent's surrender, incapacitation or death. Any questions?" Marcus cracked his knuckles with the casual air of someone about to discuss weekend plans rather than engage in potentially lethal combat. "Just one. When you said no weapons, did you mean manufactured weapons, or any weapons?" "Any weapons," Vexstar confirmed, wondering where this was going. "Cool, so if I hypothetically ripped off one of your arms and used it to beat you unconscious, that would be considered unarmed combat." The silence that followed was the kind you hear in museums and morgues. Vexstar's crystalline features shifted into what might have been amusement, or possibly the early stages of concern. "Theoretical discussions aside," Vexstar said carefully, "I believe you will find that ripping off my appendages is considerably more difficult than your human optimism suggests." "We'll see," Marcus replied with the kind of cheerful confidence that had gotten humanity into trouble since the dawn of time. The combat began with Vexstar demonstrating why he had never lost a final examination. His crystalline form moved with liquid grace, each strike calculated to exploit the obvious weaknesses in human anatomy. His first attack should have removed Marcus's head from his shoulders with surgical precision. Instead, Marcus ducked under the blow, stepped inside Vexstar's guard, and punched him in what might generously be called a solar plexus. The impact created a sound like a bell being hit with a sledgehammer, followed by a noise that suggested expensive crystal was reconsidering its structural integrity. "Interesting," Vexstar observed, his voice carrying a note of surprise as he recalibrated his assessment of human striking power. Again, what followed was less a fight than a comprehensive demonstration of why the universe had spent millennia trying to keep humans from discovering how dangerous they could be when properly motivated. Vexstar's superior reach, strength and natural weaponry should have ended the combat in minutes. Instead, Marcus turned every advantage into a liability through the simple expedient of refusing to fight the way anyone expected. When Vexstar tried to use his height advantage, Marcus went low and started targeting structural joints in the crystalline Instructor's legs. When Vexstar adapted by crouching, Marcus bounced off the arena walls to attack from above. When Vexstar tried to corner him, Marcus used the Instructor's own momentum against him, turning charging attacks into controlled crashes into the arena barriers. "This is not how combat works," Vexstar protested after Marcus somehow managed to use the Instructor's own arm to hit him in the face. "You're right," Marcus agreed, breathing hard but grinning like a maniac. "This is how humans work." The turning point came when Vexstar, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, made the mistake of trying to end the fight through sheer overwhelming force. His crystalline form blazed with energy as he channeled his species' natural ability to generate focused electromagnetic pulses, the kind of attack that had reduced armored vehicles to component atoms. Marcus, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that had made humanity the galaxy's most successful accidental conquerors, didn't try to dodge or defend. Instead, he grabbed the nearest metallic object, which happened to be a piece of arena equipment that had been knocked loose during the fight, and used it as a lightning rod. The electromagnetic pulse, instead of vaporizing Marcus, was channeled through the improvised conductor and directly back into Vexstar's crystalline matrix. The feedback loop created a light show that could be seen from orbit and a sound like the universe's largest tuning fork being struck by a meteor. When the smoke cleared, Vexstar was on the ground, his crystalline form flickering with residual energy discharges, while Marcus stood over him holding what remained of the makeshift lightning rod and looking like he'd been struck by lightning, which he had. "You know," Marcus said conversationally, his hair standing on end and his uniform smoking slightly, "I really didn't think that was going to work." Vexstar struggled to his feet, his crystalline features cycling through what appeared to be several different emotions before settling on something that might have been respect or possible mild concussion. "How?" he asked simply. Marcus shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey the entire human approach to problem solving. "I figured if I was going to get electrocuted anyway, I might as well make it productive." The arena fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened. Marcus had not only survived combat with Instructor Vexstar, he had won through a combination of tactical creativity, physical resilience, and the kind of logic that made perfect sense to humans and gave everyone else existential headaches. "Well," Vexstar said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been pride, "I suppose that concludes your final examination." "Actually," Marcus replied, reaching down to help his defeated Instructor to his feet, "I think it's just getting started." 3 days later, Marcus Rodriguez walked across the Academy's graduation platform carrying Instructor Vexstar on his shoulders in what the Academy's public relations department was desperately trying to spin as a traditional display of mutual respect between warrior and mentor. The fact that Vexstar was unconscious and wrapped in medical bandages somewhat undermined this narrative, but nobody was brave enough to correct the official record. The graduation ceremony was being broadcast across 17 star systems, partly because it was traditional and partly because nobody believed the reports coming out of the Academy and wanted to see the evidence for themselves. The sight of a human successfully completing the program was causing stock market fluctuations, treaty renegotiations, and at least 3 minor religious schisms among species that had built their entire worldview around human inferiority. Marcus deposited his Instructor gently into a hover chair that had been hastily requisitioned from the medical wing, then straightened his dress uniform and tried to look like someone who hadn't just spent 3 months redefining what was physically possible through sheer bloody-minded determination. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted life forms," announced Academy Commandant Threxver, a being who looked like someone had crossed a sea urchin with a filing cabinet and given the result administrative responsibilities. "We are gathered here to witness the graduation of Training Class Omega 77. The surviving members of Marcus's class stood at attention, looking like they'd been through a war and won, which was essentially accurate. Pip had grown 3 inches and developed what could only be described as confidence-induced swagger. Gornath had somehow become more optimistic, which for a sentient rock formation was a significant psychological development. Zara had stopped reading minds voluntarily and started using her telepathic abilities to project encouraging thoughts, which was either character growth or a survival mechanism. This class, Commandant Threxver continued, consulting notes that had been heavily edited by the legal department, has achieved several notable distinctions. They have the lowest casualty rate in Academy history, the highest aggregate performance scores, and have collectively broken 47 training records, most of which we didn't know could be broken. Marcus waved at the crowd with the casual friendliness of someone who had just accidentally revolutionized military training theory. In the audience, representatives from a dozen different species were frantically taking notes and updating their strategic assessments of human military potential. However, the commandant continued, "This ceremony is not merely about acknowledging past achievements, it is about preparing our graduates for their future responsibilities." This was when Vexitar chose to regain consciousness, which he did with the grace and dignity of someone waking up from a 3-day medically induced coma in front of a live interstellar audience. "Where am I?" Vexitar asked groggily, his crystalline features flickering as his nervous system rebooted. "Graduation ceremony," Marcus replied helpfully. "You missed the speeches, but they're about to get to the good part." Vexitar struggled to focus on his surroundings, took in the assembled crowd, the broadcast equipment, and the fact that he was sitting in a medical chair while his former student stood at attention in a dress uniform. "Did I lose?" he asked, the question carrying the kind of existential weight that comes with having your entire worldview restructured by electromagnetic feedback. "You prefer to think of it as provided valuable learning opportunities," Marcus suggested diplomatically. The commandant cleared his throat, which sounded like gravel being sorted by size. "Graduate Rodriguez, please step forward." Marcus approached the podium with the easy confidence of someone who had spent 3 months proving that impossible was just another word for hasn't been tried by a human yet. "Marcus Rodriguez," the commandant announced, "you have not only completed the most challenging military training program in the known galaxy, you have redefined what we consider possible for biological entities operating within the normal parameters of physics." The crowd applauded with varying degrees of enthusiasm and terror, depending on their species' historical relationship with humans. "Therefore," the commandant continued, "it is my honor to award you the rank of lieutenant, and assign you to your first official duty station." Marcus accepted his commission with the appropriate dignity, then waited for the traditional assignment announcement that would determine where he'd spend the next phase of his military career. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," the commandant announced, "you are hereby assigned as assistant instructor at the Galactic Military Training Academy, effective immediately." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before major historical events. Marcus blinked, processed this information, and then began to smile with the kind of expression that had been giving alien civilizations nightmares since first contact. "Assistant instructor?" Marcus asked, just to make sure he'd heard correctly. "That's correct. You'll be working with Instructor Vexitar to develop new training protocols for the Academy's next incoming class." Vexitar's crystalline features went through several rapid color changes as he realized what this meant. "Next incoming class?" "Yes," the commandant confirmed cheerfully. 47 humans from the Terran Defense Force will be arriving next week for advanced combat training." The sound that came from Vexitar might have been laughter, or possibly the noise crystalline beings make when they experience complete psychological breakdown. Marcus patted his instructor's shoulder in what was probably meant to be a comforting gesture. "Don't worry," Marcus said reassuringly. "I'll help you adjust the training regimen to accommodate human physiology. We're going to have so much fun." In the audience, Pip began vibrating with excitement. Gornath made his happy avalanche noise, and Zara projected a telepathic message that roughly translated to "the galaxy is so screwed" in 14 different languages. As the ceremony concluded, and the crowd began to disperse, representatives from various military organizations could be heard frantically updating their strategic assessments, defense budgets, and insurance policies. The age of human military involvement in galactic affairs was about to begin, and everyone involved was beginning to understand that the universe was about to become a much more interesting, and significantly more dangerous, place. Marcus Rodriguez, meanwhile, was already planning training exercises that would make his own academy experience look like a relaxing vacation. After all, if one human could accidentally break an entire military training system, imagine what 47 humans could accomplish when they were actually trying. The galaxy was about to find out, whether it wanted to or not.